Welcome to another very special edition of Under the Tin. And I'm delighted to say that I am joined by Zena Wooldridge, who is the newly appointed president of the World Squash Federation. So, Zena, firstly, congratulations on the new appointment. And secondly, thank you very much for joining us today. So, how's things? Where are you? What's been going on in your world recently?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you make maximum advantage of lockdown in terms of the work that we can do behind the scenes, whilst there aren't too many events happening. So there's just lots to do. You know, there's plenty to keep us busy and keep us out of mischief during during a lockdown period. You know, there's a new office. We've got a new board. You know, William's now been in post for just over 12 months, and so you know he's well established, and we're pulling a new strategy together. So you know, there's never any shortage of things to do.
No, well, we're going to dive into that a little bit later on. But let's just do some scene setting. And I mean, do you want to talk us through your background and your journey through squash to the point that you arrived as the president of the World Squash Federation?
Yes, certainly. Yes. So I suppose my squash playing really started to take off probably when I went to university. So I was a reasonably late starter. Didn't start playing squash until I was probably about 16 or 17, and had a great experience of squash whilst I was at University of Warwick. Happened to. I think there's a moral in there about choosing your team well, because in the 5 years that I spent as a university student, including a sabbatical year, we were always in either the semi-finals or finals of British universities. 3 years at Warwick and was it 4 years at Warwick, 1 year at Loughborough. I did choose my team well, so yeah, we had a great time in that respect. I've always worked in sport. Sport's been my career. So I've always had a background in multi-sport, and squash has had a feature in that. But I've always then had a parallel track as a volunteer, and part of that in multi-sport, in university sport. But certainly my specialism being squash. Mm-hmm. So you know, my route to becoming president of World Squash has actually taken a route through being on the squash committee of British universities. I played for British universities as a student. As you know, Jethro, involved very much in organising British university tournaments, of which you played a big role. And it's amazing now going through in my role as president of World Squash, how many former students are now in one squash role or another that I come across every week, you know, and it's just great. It's just great to see that squash family grow up, and you know, and have families of their own, and their kids now playing, you know. So it comes right round, and I then got involved in, well, as you know, I was chair of England squash for 6 years, which was just an amazing experience. It was very challenging. Mm-hmm. But a great experience. Then spent 8 years in European squash, 6 of those as president of European squash, and then had a year break before being elected as president of World Squash. So, you know, I suppose I've experienced it at local, university, national, regional, and now world level. And I would say that probably most of my personal development has probably come from my volunteering activities, either in multisport or in squash. I've learned a lot through that route, but also had the huge privilege of working in university sport for 30 years. And, you know, fantastic to work with young, bright, talented, enthusiastic young people.
Well, I know you're a big advocate of pushing squash within the university, so maybe that's something we'll touch upon a little bit later as well. So, I mean, just to give us a global overview then at this stage, you know, I guess we're obviously going through the COVID pandemic, and that's brought its new challenges. But where do you think the game is at a global level across the board? What's your perception, kind of looking at the game on a global scale?
Well, I think we've got a combination of mature markets and new growing markets, and it's very much in flux. I think some of the established and mature markets are probably having to work very hard to maintain their position, to keep courts open, to keep their player bases, and probably fighting and battling against an increasingly competitive marketplace with new sports coming in and a lot for youngsters to choose from. And then you've got probably stable, established markets, and then some that are growing and some that are really exciting opportunities going forward. Such as USA still probably got a lot of growth to go. You've got India that's still got, I think, a lot of growth potential, but then you've got China and Russia and some of the other Asian nations, along with South America, that I think has got huge potential. So I do think it's very much a mix. You think about squash is approaching its 200th anniversary, 2030. Alan Thatcher does remind me. And, you think about it started as a Commonwealth sport, but now the biggest region by a long way is Europe, both in terms of nations and players. But I think Asia's coming up fast behind. So, it is very much, I think, a mix. And I think we'll see very much variation across the world in terms of how quickly different parts of the world bounce back after COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, can you give us a little bit of insight for those of us that don't necessarily know what is going on in Russia and China? Is that like, how tied is that to a potential Olympic status, or is that just happening kind of organically because they're falling in love with the game?
I had a brief meeting with the board earlier and about a particular particular subject, and I think we got a bet on of how long we would go into the podcast before the Olympics was mentioned. So it didn't go very. It was only about 10 minutes. So there we go.
I was actually saving that big question for.
Well, we'll keep it later then. Yeah, okay. Where are those nations? I don't know. I haven't got into the detail of it, but what is great to see is that those nations are now appearing quite frequently on the list of bids for events, for hosting events. They've got players that are starting to come through and appear in world rankings, albeit lower in the world rankings. More often got teams competing in either regional or world championships, and they are putting in very good bids to host events. So, and they are important. They're important big players, whether you're talking about Olympics or World University Games, which is obviously the second biggest multi-sport event in the world. They're very much in there and influencing and using those kind of World University Games as the platform to then host Olympics. So they're important to us, and increasingly on the radar.
For sure. So, I mean, what do you think we're doing particularly well then as a sport at the moment? So if we take geography out of the question, where do we think the sport is really excelling, and what the exciting things going on within the game? I guess outside of COVID, would you say?
I mean, I think we've got to compliment PSA for the work that they've done over the last 5 or 6 years. The investment that they've made in improving the presentation, actually, of having their own OTT platform, their Squash TV, has done a tremendous job, and actually the equality that the parity that they've brought since bringing the men's and the women's organisations together. The fact they've been able to continue with tournaments, albeit under very strict safety conditions, that they've been able to continue with some events through the pandemic, and their new relationship with Infront, and hopefully projection in terms of higher profile. So I think I think that's an area that we should really compliment them on. I think we underplay our network of junior events and the extent to which we've got a big junior playing competition, international network of competitions. I think we underplay that. I think it's a bit invisible, and I think many sports would love to have, for example, global events for juniors that stretch that go through the age groups from under 19 right down to under 11s. You know, I think that's really tremendous, and I think that will only grow. But we need to do more with it, and we need to profile it a lot better. I think we're doing some I think areas where we're doing some really quite progressive work now is in coaching.
Yep.
And I think that's got a real potential, and that's kind of your great love, and you can see from inside what we're trying to achieve with that. And I do think you know, that has tremendous opportunity in terms of growing the game by having more and more quality coaches across the globe. In the survey that we've just done, there's probably around 60% of nations who are now buying into WSF's coaching program because they don't have their own. And I think that probably reflects how important coaching is going forward, particularly in those smaller nations that you know, have ambitions to grow, because you know, quality coaches are so critical to the growth of squash and the quality experience. So, you know, I think that's another area that I think there's huge potential. But there's lots of areas, I think, where we've also got quite a lot of work to do.
Well, we'll touch upon those in a minute, but it seems like a good point to talk about the foundation coaching course that we are releasing together. So Squash Skills and the World Squash Federation in conjunction with each other. You know, this digital platform that Michael Kahn has been working on alongside Jesse Engelbrecht. You know, it's been a good solid 6 months of work, but I think it's a very exciting tool to potentially bring. I mean, our ambition is to try and qualify 2 new coaches in every club around the world, with the hope that those coaches then go on to run, you know, whether they be beginner sessions for juniors or beginner sessions for adults, but about making things fun, making the sport fun, and showcasing it to new people and attracting new people into squash clubs, because that's going to be essential, right? Isn't it? We've got to get new people into squash clubs once we return from COVID. And I think having this digital resource and this digital platform where people can become, you know, recognized squash coaches through the WSF is going to be a phenomenal opportunity and stepping stone, really, to help the game bounce back. So it's you know, certainly been nice to work alongside you guys and Michael to develop that, and we're, you know, launching that at the beginning, early April, which I think is a particularly exciting time.
Yeah, and you know, and it comes at, alongside the launch of the World Squash Officiating Platform as well. So, you know, it's great to see a relatively small national governing body or world governing body kind of go digital and hybrid, because I just think that blended learning is a great opportunity. And I you know, I agree with you. You know, it's got to be about fun. Those coaches need to enthuse and inspire people, but they also need to be enthused and inspired as well. Because it's almost like we're expecting them to be the Pied Pipers of, you know, of inspiring a new generation of players. So, you know, it's pretty critical. And, you know, talking with Alan Thatcher about World Squash Day and how we might shape that and what the theme is and whatever, but fun has got to be a good part of it, you know, fun and fitness with friends and family. And, you know, that I think that's got to be the future way forward in terms of just having great fun.
Well, there's a lot of competition out there. There's a lot of fun things to do, on whether it be on computer screens or phones or tablets. You know, we're not just competing against other sports, are we? We're competing against gaming and, you know, whatever it is. So whatever we do, we've got to make that 45 minutes, that 1 hour on a squash court really, really fun, so that people want to come back and do it again. So those coaches, those people that introduce people to the sport are just absolutely crucial. So you touched upon you know, the digital aspects of the sport, And with your new role as president, is that something you're going to be looking to kind of embrace over the next period and really drive forward the kind of the digital component of the game?
Yeah, and I'm not an expert in this area. What I have found is you can't be an expert at everything, but you do need to have a grasp of what the key fundamentals are. It's absolutely essential, absolutely critical going forward. But I think one of the things we just need to be aware of in terms of the whole digital thing is being really clear on what our outcomes are. What outcomes are we trying to achieve, and therefore, how and when is digital relevant to that? And I think there's no doubt that, with a staff of 2 full-time paid staff and a number of very part-timers and an absolute army of enthusiastic volunteers who are an expert in their particular areas in many cases, we need lots of help, and the digital side is going to be really crucial going forward. And but we need to be, first of all, really clear on what we're trying to achieve.
For sure. Well, I know you're working on a roadmap and a strategy at the moment, aren't you? So is that going to be something that's published to the wider audience, or is that an internal kind of?
I'm very much of a view that there's absolutely no point in having an internal document that sits on a shelf and gathers dust, because there's no point in having it. The whole idea of the strategies that we get out there, and it's we consult.
Mm-hmm.
So we have something to start with. So we're not starting off with another strategic review, because how many of those have we done? There's a lot of material already out there, and PSA has written a strategy that's had help from Deloitte, and there's some really good stuff in there that we need, as WSF, need to respond to. But we will have some road shows, because a strategy does 2 purposes. One, it gives us really clear direction, but the other thing is it brings the squash community together.
Mm-hmm.
We're all pulling in the same direction, but this actually producing a strategy and going through consultation is a fantastic tool for bringing the squash community together behind some common goals, such that they own it. It needs to belong not to the board but to the whole squash community. It needs to be owned by the regional presidents and the regional federations, and by the national presidents and national federations. We all need to work together, and this is a tool. The strategy is simply a tool for doing that, for pulling us all together, because could be really powerful together. But what we do know is that we're so little resource, we are reliant, and we always will be reliant upon our volunteer experts. And there's some fantastic talent and knowledge out there. But we need a tool to make sure we bring them together, and we're coordinating things behind a common cause and a common set of objectives. So we're all pulling in the same direction.
That makes total sense. So, I mean, obviously you're going through this process at the moment, and we've talked about where the sport is excelling, but I guess it's interesting to ask you what some of the hurdles are that have been identified, and where you see some of the issues that we need to overcome as a sport, particularly in the face of COVID, I guess. So. Yeah,
and there are challenges and there are opportunities, and part of it is turning the challenges into opportunities, isn't it? And one of the important things, I think, is making sure that actually we've got a really clear demarcation between this is what PSA are doing, and this is their strategy, and this is what they're doing really well and can do really well, and this is WSF's role, and this is the remit of WSF. So we can glue the 2 together really tightly, so that we can work together going forward in partnership, knowing exactly what each is contributing to the overall our overall mission, and working together, not just with WSF and PSA, but working together with other stakeholders, whether they be whether they be ball manufacturers or court manufacturer builders or whatever. If we can all work together, that will be that's going to be really helpful. But what are the challenges going forward? Well, the challenges going forward are going to be about sustaining and growing the game, and what's the value proposition that we've got, that we're providing out there to member federations, and also I think going forward, a much bigger emphasis on the B2C relationship. Previously, we've had a B2B relationship because we're a federation of federations, and I member federations, and to some extent our accredited suppliers have been our B2B relationship. But I think, you know, going forward with the opportunity of growing Spin,
Yep.
we can grow a much bigger B2C relationship. And I think when you come to be talking with either sponsors or IOC or multi-sport games, or the, you know, the Pan Am Games or you know, we've got a much stronger B2C community, and I think that's going to be important going forward. But, you know, multi-sport games is key to us as well. You know, we're in some of the big multi-sport games, but we're not in all of them. And, you know, so we're in Commonwealth Games, Pan Am, Asian World Games, World University Championships, but not in World University Games, and that's another one we've got targeted. You know, because they are a unique platform for us, albeit every 4 years, you know, but they are the platform that we've got to reach new audiences, and very significant audiences. So we need to make sure we make the most of those opportunities, but also secure our positions, make sure we do have our positions secured in those multi-sport games as core sports, and then we go forward in terms of the European Games, and have a serious bid for getting into the European Games, bearing in mind how big Europe is for us as a region, and the scale of that we've got of engagement in competition, both junior, senior, and masters. But then also African Games, World University Games, ultimately, and then let's see what happens in terms of doors opening potentially for Olympics in future. Who knows?
So how big and impactful, you know, this question was going to come later in the podcast, but given we're on it now, I mean, how big and how impactful do you think squash's status, or squash being an Olympic sport, would be? What would the impact in your mind be for the health of the sport generally? Like how huge an effect?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think first of all, if we're going forward with Olympics, the strategy that we have must be the best strategy for the sport, and not just the best strategy for the Olympics. You know, and hopefully our strategy will respond to I think the key challenges in the international sporting landscape that are relevant to squash, and to ensure squash thrives. And if that also happens to coincide with what's right for getting us opening the doors for the Olympics, then it shows us that actually that then shows that the Olympic ambitions are more of a reality. But what you know, what are the benefits? Well, the benefits are that you get exposure on a global on a global scale every 4 years.
Yep.
I think the events that then are likely to lead into the Olympics are going to become more important in future as well for those Olympic sports. I think they're going to have a much bigger platform going forward, and then I just, the whole fact of being inside the Olympic tent rather than outside it, there are streams of funding coming down from the Olympics, from broadcasting and ticketing rights and sponsorship rights. But then within each nation, I think perhaps the biggest impact is that in each individual nation, the squash federation sits within their Olympic camp and not outside it. And that has a big difference in terms of the quality of support they receive. And I think for nations, it makes probably greater impact for the national federations than it does anywhere else. Yeah. You know, for their athletes to be actually part of an Olympic family within their nation, rather than sitting outside it or sitting on the periphery, makes a big difference, funding wise, support wise, status wise, profile wise. And I think that's probably why it's so important to PSA, also for their players.
Yeah, totally. No, we'll keep on hoping, right? We'll keep on working hard. Well, more than hope, but I know there's a lot of work that goes on.
Yeah, but I think we need a plan. We need a robust plan that covers all areas and analyses all areas. So we have clarity as a sport, not just as a WSF board or a PSA board or a collective board collectively between us, that we know where we're going. But I think we've got clarity within our sport of whether we are looking at future Olympic status and why we're doing that and what the value is for it, and therefore what the cost is going to be of getting there.
Sure. And I mean, the impact of the Olympics on funding within those nations, I mean, that's obviously pretty significant as well. It opens up new funding streams for the member nations, right? And then presumably that has a trickle-down effect within each of the nations as well.
It does, yeah. That's and I think that's where nations and national federations would say where probably the biggest benefit lies. Sure. Because at the end of the day, the Olympics is only every 4 years in terms of your profile. I mean, it's useful profile, but it is, it is every 4 years. So it's what's that sustainability through the 4-year cycle as well.
And so, having come through multi-sport and been involved heavily with England squash and ESF, I mean, can you talk to us a little bit about what funding's done, over maybe the last 20 years within the sport of squash, and how it's shifted, how the landscape's maybe shifted in terms of accessing funding at a national level? I guess it'd be interesting for people to understand typically how it's worked and how the landscape's changed recently.
Yeah, sometimes it's a blessing and sometimes it's not necessarily. But I was chair of England squash from 2006 to 2012, and that was at the peak of our funding because of the timing with Olympics and the amount of funding that was coming through national governing bodies. But as I said when I was chair, probably in about 2009-10, I was saying, just guys, this isn't going to last. We've got 64 staff and that's not sustainable. So we really do need to build the base and use some of that to strengthen the base of our volunteer infrastructure, because we will always be reliant upon our volunteer infrastructure and the professional infrastructure we build around our sport that isn't necessarily embedded within the governing body. So I think the governing bodies need to some extent be enablers and not doers. They can't be delivering everything because there just isn't the resource there. And I think that was probably a lesson learned during that period of time, because so much funding was put into governing bodies, but then subsequently it's been removed. And it's not just squash, it's most sports. I think most squash has probably lost out a bit more is at the performance level, because again, it's not receiving funding through UK sport, it's receiving funding from the top end of Sport England. Mm-hmm. So it kind of falls down the gap in between UK sport and Sport England. So, I think, we did go through a heyday at a time when I was chair of England squash, but it's not just squash that suffered as a result of that funding coming out. Mm-hmm. And there's more and more competition. We see more and more new sports coming in. Whether it's skateboarding or esports or whatever, there's more competition now, especially for young people, in terms of how they spend their time, how parents spend their time, and how parents spend their money on what their kids are doing.
100%. Well, it's a commitment. I think back to my playing days on the junior circuit and the number of hours or days spent in squash clubs in different parts of the country that mum and dad gave up to facilitate that. It seems a huge commitment, playing a match on a Friday night and potentially seeing it all the way through to a final on a Sunday. It's a big, long, expensive road.
So, parents are a huge stakeholder for us, a huge stakeholder.
No, absolutely. I just wanted to keep going on the funding route a little bit. So with obviously you look at the US, and that's a very commercial model. Lots of people are spending money at a junior level, and it's US squash is a successful business. And then it's interesting, that funding's kind of gone away in the UK, and you talked about the need for volunteers. Do you think that's crucial now that we have more kind of hands on the ground at grassroots level volunteering, or is there another kind of a way that we need to go in the UK, which is maybe a little bit more US focused, with people being prepared to put their hand in their pocket a little bit more and spend a bit more within the sport to fund coaches, to upkeep clubs?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the pieces of work, and I know that my friend Thomas Trodson has said for a number of years, that what we need is for someone to do a study of the different business models for squash around the world, because they are very different. And I have to say, the US model is very different. I've worked in universities for 20 odd years, 30 years, and the differences in the models between philanthropy in the US and philanthropy in the UK is a different world. People are so much more giving in the US. It's a culture that they have. And therefore, I think the US has been able to focus on a relatively small, wealthy group of people, and being fortunate enough to attract significant philanthropy. I just think it's very difficult to try to take that model and think that you can plant it somewhere else, because we have tried, and we've had some very, very clever people trying that in the UK, and it doesn't happen. What we did a fundraising for our new sports facility and put a lot of effort into it, and generated about £500,000, whereas in a similar university in the US, they would probably generate 10 times that just for their annual renewal of sports facilities, and that's the difference in the culture.
Yeah,
I think it's I think we have to look at what the British culture is and what other cultures are, in Europe, and in other parts of the world, and make sure that the model that we're adopting fits the culture. In Commonwealth nations, we've got a heavy I think we've got a heavy philosophy and psyche of subsidising our sport, and thinking actually that £5 for a squash court's quite a lot of money, whereas we'll pay 40 quid to go and watch a football match. But in other nations, it's a fully commercial model. In Poland, they've built a model based upon people being quite willing to pay 25 or 30 euros for a squash court, and they don't quibble at that because it's what they're used to.
Yep.
So they're very different models, and I think it's the one thing I worry about in the UK is and probably applies to quite a number of other Commonwealth nations, is our sustainability, and ensuring that actually we can maintain the quality of the environment that we've got for squash, whether that's about investing in squash courts to make sure that they're at decent quality, or that you've got decent club room, a bar, nice changing rooms, because that's what the expectations are these days. And we need to have clubs that have a sustainable enough business model to be able to reinvest, because otherwise they won't attract young people and they'll lose members quickly. So those that can reinvest because they've got the right model, and usually it's where squash is alongside something else rather than sitting on its own. I think the days when you can sustain a club that's got 4 courts and nothing else, I think that's where we're going to struggle in the future. I think it's part of something else.
Whose role is it to be helping the clubs figure out the business model? Do you think it's on the club, or is it kind of on the regional level, or the governing bodies within nations?
But it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because one could be devil's advocate and say, well, is that the role of the national governing body? And actually, they have been doing some work. For example, Mick Todd's been going around the country visiting clubs and advising and helping with some aspects of that. I think it's having a holistic model where you've got all of the component parts that work together, and you're creating an environment that's very member friendly and junior friendly. And we come back to the coach. I think the coach is key in that. know, having the right coach. And the right coach is not necessarily the person with the best technical skills. The right coach is the person who will go out and pull members in and have relationships with schools and develop a thriving junior group that where the kids want to come back and the parents are keen for them to be there. You know, when I was a youngster, I'd probably spend most of my summer vacations, my summer holidays, my school holidays at the club.
Yeah.
Playing, you know. I'm not sure so much that happens but you know, it's a safe environment, isn't it, for kids to be in. So I think it's about that holistic model of a club that's got a good strategy and has got a reinvestment policy and has probably diversified its range of products sufficiently to make sure that you know, it is sustainable and it's got reserves that it can reinvest to for renewals and upgrading the club in all of its parts, you know. And you look at female players, and we're not going to attract female players unless we've got really nice changing rooms with hair dryers. And I'm not, you know, and people might say, well, you know, they're luxuries, but actually they're necessities in today's age, and we need to get all of those touch points right for the whole package to be right.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, Pontefract's just a kind of exemplary beacon, isn't it? When you look at, you know, I've obviously spent a lot of time there, having made the 2 documentaries, one with Malcolm and one about the club. And for me, it's all about community. You know,
it's embedded in the community. Yeah, absolutely.
It's an extension of people's front rooms, and they're as comfortable in there in the bar as they are in their front room. And you know, what Mick and Malcolm have done and how they've fostered that is phenomenal. And it's, you know, it's not easy to replicate, right? They're fairly unique characters. But
you know, but you come back to the role of the volunteer, you know, in terms of enthusing, you know, and inspiring them. But our volunteers need to be enthused and inspired, and they also then need to go and do that with others, so that, you know, when you are, you know, I've been a volunteer all my life from club level right the way through, and you have to have fun. It has to be, you need to enjoy working with the people you're working with, see that you're getting something in return, some success, you know, but you're enjoying what you're doing. You know, and that's what we need to make sure that people enjoy what they do.
Well, we've had interesting conversations about the need to attract young adults into the sport. And obviously it's probably a good time to touch upon university squash as well. But I mean, in your mind, what should we be doing? How should clubs, how should universities, or what should we be doing to attract beginner adults into the sport? And you know, what tools do you think we have at our disposal to bring new blood into the sport?
So I'll just cite a couple of situations, a couple of instances where I think that universities are key. I can remember having a meeting with an academic colleague about riverbank erosion, because we got problems with our rowing club, and he came in and he was talking to me about squash, and he was playing squash with his son. His son was at Oxford or Cambridge and had been doing rowing for a couple of years, and he said, well, he was in his final year and he hadn't got time for rowing anymore, so he's taken up squash instead. And so his dad was playing squash with him, and he loved it because it only took 40 minutes and he could kept himself fit. And I'm thinking, that's a great story. You know, that's why squash is relevant to today's society, where even more so than perhaps the 70s or 80s when it really boomed, you know, where a lot of business people or whatever were playing because it was short and sharp, and then they could have a drink in the bar afterwards and that's it, they'd done their exercise. Well, that's probably even more relevant to today's society, except that there's far more competition now across the sports. That was one story. The other one was that we had a PSL match, and along came 4 Chinese students, came to watch, and they'd not seen squash necessarily before, but they came and they were really excited by it, and they'd got their book with them about learn to play squash.
Right.
And they were really enthused by it. And I'm thinking, you know, there's a market, there's another reflection of how exciting and attractive our sport is to young people. But, you know, look at the socioeconomic groups, and if we've got nearly 50% of the 18-year-olds going to university, and they have an opportunity at 18 to completely reinvent themselves, which you know all about. You can completely reinvent yourself, because almost every part of your life can change at 18.
Mm-hmm.
And for some, squash and sport is the consistent piece, that strand that goes through that. But we've got the opportunity not just about our existing audience of 18-year-olds that come in, but also the lapsed players, that stop playing because of A-levels or whatever, but then also the new audience, of capturing them. And how much advertising are we doing on Come to Learn to play squash across our gyms? Because gyms are kind of mindless ways of keeping fit, but actually surely squash is more exciting. But how can we get that transferable interest? Because we know that a lot of people who play squash don't only play squash, they do it alongside probably a number of other activities. But there is huge potential there, and I do think that squash appeals really well to that young audience. We've seen a real growth in the demand for university to play in university sport, university squash, over the last 10 years, and in female as well. So I do think there's a lot more work we can do, but the one bit that we haven't got right yet is the exit strategy, and how are we capturing them when they graduate and go out to somewhere else. To what extent are the universities pushing in a certain direction towards clubs, and to what extent are clubs pulling those young people in at 21 and getting them into their club, because they're also the future, not just the future players, but the future volunteers as well, for those clubs. And I think that's where, we might prevent them falling off a cliff at 18, but then we're not necessarily preventing them falling off the cliff at 21 when they graduate. And I think we've got some work to do there.
Yeah.
So I think there's huge potential there for the sport. And if we can, that's where we need to ride off the platform as well of events like the Commonwealth Games, because we suddenly get that great exposure. We suddenly have that great exposure of the sport to a new audience, broadcast to a new audience. And, we saw what happened after the Olympics, where people turned up at athletics clubs and hockey clubs and whatever. And a lot of those clubs just weren't well prepared to deal with that in terms of their volunteers and their coaches and whatever, to receive those people and to keep them, as a new audience. And I think that's where squash needs a plan off the back of the Commonwealth Games, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in England, UK, or further afield in the Commonwealth. Let's use that opportunity and make sure our clubs are in a real state of readiness to receive that upsurge and be able to receive it, make it welcome, and keep it, keep that demand and inspire those people.
For sure. And I mean, we've talked about it again before, about the importance of the good social side around squash, and the importance of obviously making it welcoming. But I think in the 70s and 80s, the squash club was a real hub of activity. It was hanging around and having some beers afterwards, and it's obviously difficult with COVID, having spent a little bit of time in some squash clubs over the last year, without the socializing element. But I think it's really important that we do build the social side back into squash, try and make events fun. Shorter, sharper single day events seem to have been on the rise over the last couple of years, or prior to COVID, certainly. The one day events, the best of threes. Just interested to hear your take on that, particularly when thinking about the young adults as well, giving people the ability to.
Yeah. And I think we've got a really good programme in most nations, and certainly England has got a fantastic programme for juniors, and a quite good programme for masters. But other than if you're a PSA player, what have you got if you're aged 19 to 34? And I think that's where there's a real opportunity. When I was in my 20s, each weekend throw my kit bag in the back of my Mini and off I'd go to the next graded tournament. And that was fantastic, you know, because you got around the country, you met new people, you had some great squash, it was great socially, and I think we just need to do a lot more of that. And you know, I think the area where England squash has got very limited resource, you know, got about 15 staff now, so they can't be doing all of that. But I think somehow we need to enable that to happen, and I think squash levels is a good way of doing that. That can be the replacement for the graded system that we had, you know, back in the 80s and 90s that enabled that whole infrastructure to happen. It was a platform on which it could happen. So I think it's a case of how and who will coordinate that and kind of make it happen. But I think, you know, the whole concept of squash levels could help that along its way, you know. But I just think that whole thing about social squash is really important. You know, you will get those who are the diehards and are really competitive and will travel wherever to play squash. But you know, I think even in the recovery process, as part of the recovery from COVID, I think if clubs can develop a program of social squash competition with a drink in the bar and a curry afterwards, you know, I think it will go a long way towards pulling back in those lapsed players.
Absolutely. And what's your awareness around, you know, some of the racket sports that seem to be on the up at the moment, such as paddle and pickleball? They seem to be getting that social component right, and I think maybe doubles is having something to play within those sports as well.
Well, you know, they're easy to play, aren't they? You know, they're outdoors, so that has its advantages and its disadvantages. So it's has its advantages in COVID, when you can actually do some outdoor activity but not indoor, so they'll have a slight advantage. But it's easy to play. You know, it's easy to play. Yes, you can play doubles, but then, you know, you can do that with squash as well, and squash 57.
Yep.
You know, and I played what was racquetball, now squash 57, even from the early 80s or mid 80s. I played for it alongside squash. It was, for me, it was the real fun bit.
Right.
You know, I played squash a bit more seriously. I could never take squash 57 seriously. It was just great fun. I just loved playing. And I think that has huge potential if we think about it as the two ends of the spectrum in our curve, our age group curve of participation. You know, at the early ages, it allows grandparents to play with their grandkids on the same court. You know, you've got female players who may find squash a little bit daunting. You've got those players who have got dodgy knees and whatever, who will play squash 50. It just extends the ends of our participation for squash as a whole. But I think we need to promote it a bit more. It's all very well rebranding it, you know. WSF did a rebranding exercise, but how much, you know, Patrick as chair of the Squash 57 Commission, he's doing some fantastic work with Squash 57 and starting to roll it across regions. But you know, it's still very patchy in terms of demand, even in England, even in the UK. So I think we've got a bit more work to do there. But I think it's the squash's version of pickleball to some extent. It's easy to play. You can play when it's raining and snowing and whatever. You can't necessarily do that with some of the outdoor activities. So I think we need to capitalise a lot more on it.
So do you think that will fall into the WSF kind of roadmap and strategic plan you're working on? So expect
it's going to be really important. Absolutely, will be really important.
I think it makes total sense. And I guess the other thing that has been touched upon earlier on in this series with the likes of Mick Todd is the use of the correct ball early on, and more ball education, right? Lowering that barrier to entry.
I would almost say let's take the double yellow away, and you can only buy that through PSA or whatever. You know, the double yellow is PSA's ball. If I want to be devil's advocate, you know, we've got a big education program to do, and we're talking with Dunlop, but it's also across the range of balls about how we do that, but also talking with them about saying, look, rather than saying these are the 4 balls for squash and these are the 2 balls for squash 57. No, it's a whole suite. Let's advertise it as a whole suite, or even even to the extent of making the red dot a bit bigger so that there's a bit more of a suite of sizes, so to speak. But yeah, we need it. So it's about saying that rather than it being the official ball, it's the right ball. And we did this a few years ago. I think I was still chair of England Squash, and we did a campaign with Dunlop at the time about going out and advertising and the whole suite of 4 balls, and it was really effective. But I think you've got to keep it up. You've got to keep on and keep promoting it, because if you let it drop off, then clubs will only order double yellows again, and so people only think there's a double yellow ball. No, so I think it's one of the things that we, when I did the squash summit, it was one of the getting the basics right. That's one of the key things we need to do in terms of getting basics right.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a big education drive that needs to happen, and it can only help. Mick also just talked about the need just to get people on a court chasing it round. Don't worry too much about the lines. Just get used to that feeling of chasing a bouncy ball back and having a good rally with your friend, and just get that smile on their faces. And
it's the essence of the game, isn't it? It's the essence of the game is getting rallies and running around. Which is why Squash 57 is great for those people who used to play really competitive squash, but their knees and hips are a bit dodgy. Then is they can get a great rally, and that's the essence of it. And I recall back to your book's final in, I don't know when it was.
Please don't go back.
And I think what was that?
Nightmares about that one.
About 2 hours, 10 minutes or something. And you get to the 5th game and you're thinking, now it's getting interesting. Now it's getting interesting because actually both players can hardly stand up. But you're not going to get that with a double yellow dot with someone who's a lower level player. You're never going to get that thrill of that kind of that great gladiatorial nature of it, of the sport. And I think it's it's going to be really, I'll almost say, let's have World Squash Day where we play a tournament around the world, and we don't have a yellow spot anywhere. We ban it for the whole of World Squash Day. We ban any double yellow spot balls, and let's have some tournaments with a bouncy ball.
Yeah.
And, see what happens.
No, that's a fascinating idea. Well, I know we're getting towards the hour mark, so I've got a couple of final questions, really. So one word that you've used a lot over the course of this is volunteering, and I'm interested to hear how you think that people at home listening to this can help the game bounce back and get back on its feet. We do face challenges coming back from COVID, and we're all going to have to pull together in our different roles. But what would you say people listening to this can do to?
Well, I'd probably say the future of the game is in their hands. It's in all of our hands. We all need to take responsibility. And I have a philosophy that says, don't moan unless you're prepared to do something about it. And I think volunteering can be fun if you create the right environment, and we need leaders in there who are volunteer leaders who can motivate others to get involved. But if 10% of our squash community were to volunteer an hour a week or 4 hours a month to the game, we'd be in a different place. And that it can be fun. I volunteered all my life, and I've got lifelong friends around the world from my volunteering activities, and so, it can be challenging sometimes, but actually you make it fun. And the sport is not a professional sport. We have very few full-time paid people in it. So it is reliant upon the volunteer workforce. And so volunteer, put your hand up, I say, rather than moan and criticise, say, how can I help? you know, and get in there, and it's satisfying. It's you know, it is a good feeling to see other people succeed on the back of your volunteer activities, particularly when they're juniors, you know. So that would be my view. I think the future of the sport is in everybody's hands, and if everybody takes a little bit of responsibility, then we'll be in you know, in a few years' time, in 3 or 4 years' time, we'll be in a different place as a sport.
I think that's a really good point. It makes total sense. So my final question is, why should we be optimistic about the future of the sport? And what are the really optimistic things to be thinking about now at this stage?
Well, I think we still have a great sport that fits the modern lifestyle, and I think if we work hard and we're focused on how we're promoting it, then, you know, I think it will grow and it will thrive in that albeit competitive world. But we've got Commonwealth Games on the horizon. 15 months' time, we have got Commonwealth Games, and we need to do quite a lot of work to make sure that we benefit from that, and the sport benefits on the back of it, because, you know, it's broadcast to a third of the world's population, and certainly in the UK, I think it's a massive opportunity for us. We just need to make the most of it. So yeah, I think hopefully we've got a bright future. But as I say, it's in all of our hands as volunteers, and whether you're fortunate to have a full-time role in it or not. Yeah, I think it's you know, we have a bright future.
Thank you. Well, you know, thank you so much for your time today, and on behalf of the squash community, thank you for all your efforts over, you know, to date through all your volunteering. And, you know, I think it's a really exciting period ahead. Looking forward to seeing the strategy and, you know, being part of it and helping it evolve. But I think your message there to everybody at home, you know, get stuck in, and the future is bright, and we've got lots of reasons to be optimistic. So thanks very much for your time today, Zina.
Yeah, thanks, Jethro. Yeah, thanks very much.